diagram indicates that the need for reorganization after the growth has surpassed an optimal level. Project managers in media companies in San Diego, for example, prefer to work in small organizational units. San Diego area has become home to a number of companies such as MediaShare, iVid Communications, Lightspan, and Qualcomm, which produce multimedia software for CD-ROM and World Wide Web presentations or provide telecommunication solutions. In talking to several project managers in these companies, there was a feeling among them that small organizational units are more productive since they require less time to revise their projects according to new specifications provided by their clients. As you learned in the International Training Center's Managing Groups and Diversity video conference, in today's technology-driven environment, speed is essential for success. Organizations that quickly adapt to new conditions can survive and prosper. Those that cannot die and wither away. Given the rapidly changing environment, how can organizations in the public and the private sector increase their adaptability and therefore their chances of survival? How can individuals within organizations increase their viability and their chances of survival? In the past 3 years, realization among human resources development managers of the direct relationship between learning and surviving has led to the rise of a new branch of knowledge called performance technology. Performance technologists take a broad look at structure of the organization, reward systems within the organization, and learning and training systems within each organization, and provide solutions that are interrelated to those factors and other factors that may be in play in each particular circumstance. From the perspective of performance technology, learning is not a separate task from working. Working and learning are part and parcel of each other. The assumption here is that a better skilled worker is a more productive worker. Division managers, however, traditionally have been reluctant to let go of their employees, albeit for a short period of time, for training. To them, training does not lead more to productivity, but less, at least in the short run. The less time a worker spends on task, it is logical to assume that he or she is less productive. On the other hand, when a manager agrees to let go of a worker for training, quite often that worker receives training that may not be directly related to his or her tasks, may be disjointed and out of context, or may be downright irrelevant to his or her performance needs. I'm sure from time to time some of you have participated in workshops and conferences which were in your general area of interest but did not directly deal with your expectations or with your particular learning needs. I would like to propose that information and telecommunication technologies available today are solving these problems by bringing learning and training not only to the place of work but to the specific context in which work takes place. Just-in-time training is an example of such a solution that provides learning and training as well as job aids, checklists, and diagnosis and decision-making tools to the frontline worker instead of taking the worker to the learning and training. Again, the World Wide Web and video conferencing have a lot to offer in this regard. Imagine a situation where the accountant in your firm, the nurse in your hospital, the mechanic in your carpool garage, or the assembly line worker in your factory would have access to a potentially unlimited source of information in the context of her or his job. The World Wide Web and video conferencing systems provide just such a system. Training materials that are related to the culture, production procedures, and equipment configuration and requirement of your workplace can be placed on a web server so that everyone would have access to it on demand. In such a system, terminals would be provided for each or a number of employees at convenient locations so that they can refer to appropriate information when needed as they perform a particular task. Setting up a web server and connecting it to the Internet's World Wide Web may be easier than what you think. Broadly, in a basic configuration, you need the following elements: a web server, which would operate either in a Unix, Mac, or Windows NT operating environment, a terminal adapter, an ISDN line, an Internet provider, and client computers and software. Web servers are computers which will host your training and education documents and will make them available to the end user. Almost any Pentium-based or PowerPC-based computer can become a web server. The important element is not the hardware, but the software that goes on the server. To make a server out of a computer, you need a server software. There are relatively inexpensive server programs starting from $500 that can turn your PC into a web server. Training materials which need to go on your server should be coded with a special computer language called HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language. HTML codes can be written in an ordinary word processor. The codes or tags are easy to learn. This book by LeMay, entitled Teach Yourself HTML in 7 Days, will get you started as an HTML programmer in 7 days. I have used this book with several computer novices as well as professionals to teach them HTML. They all like it, and more importantly, it is highly readable and useful. A terminal adapter is a black box that connects your computer to your telecommunication lines. They range in price from $300 to $800 with different capabilities. A mid-range terminal adapter would be quite adequate to get started. An ISDN, or Integrated Services Digital Network line, is necessary to provide you with adequate bandwidth so that your employees can download files easily and quickly. I have talked about ISDN in our past broadcasts. It provides two 64 kilobits per second lines for fast telecommunication capability between the server and client computers. Finally, an Internet provider is needed to connect your ISDN line to the global Internet. Internet providers are companies which have the necessary routers, bridges, and adapters to connect your proprietary or public network to the Internet. Depending on where you are located and how telecommunication is regulated in your area, your Internet provider may be your telephone company, a private service company, a government-run post, telegraph, and telephone, or a university with Internet access. Client computer and software. Almost any computer with enough RAM, a hard drive, and a wide area network connection can be used to access the World Wide Web. Again, as was the case with the server, what is important is not the hardware, but the software. In addition to telecommunication software required to connect the computer to the Internet, you need a browser software to connect to the server computer and use its HTML files. Today, Netscape has emerged as the most popular browser software for the World Wide Web. The browser software is not very expensive and can be bought online from Netscape or offline in computer stores for about $50 or so. I presented these details about the World Wide Web to emphasize that its adoption and use in your organization is not very difficult. I am in the process of setting up a website for a medical clinic in Orange County, California, which is about 70 miles north of San Diego. The entire system has been budgeted for $15,000. By spending this much money, for example, This medical clinic, a worldwide provider of physician-supervised weight control programs, will be able to reach its clients anywhere in the world and provide its employees corporate information on demand as well as just-in-time learning capabilities. Such learning capabilities provide the dynamic tools that a growing global company needs in order to reach new clients thousands of miles away and provide them with quality care. Moreover, a World Wide Web capability complemented with video conferencing capabilities will move this medical clinic away from past linear models of performance in which performance was lockstep into a rigid series of tasks and move it closer towards a dynamic and organic performance model. Let's examine these two contrasting models and see how they differ with each other. Usually, training projects are organized around this familiar instructional system design model. In this model, which we analyzed in our previous broadcast, an instructional designer conducts a needs assessment to find out what are the training needs of the employees of an organization. Then, based on this needs assessment, instructional materials are developed and produced. Once the production process is completed, they are disseminated among its target audience. Learning results are evaluated and factored in the next iteration of the same course or a new set of instructional materials. Most training managers as well as producers of instructional materials would agree that this process is time-consuming, costly, and impractical, since the needs assessment process should precede any attempt for design and production. Furthermore, the assumption here is that the learner's needs are going to remain static until the instructional materials are developed, produced, and disseminated. Well, we know that that is hardly the case. Task-oriented people learn to fulfill their personal drive for performance. Therefore, by the time the materials are ready, the needs may dissipate. As I mentioned before, multimedia managers in software production companies invariably complain about the fact that production cycle for a product based on the ISD model is usually long and cumbersome. This makes it costly for manufacturers to observe the ISD model. In order to decrease the time allocated to the production cycle, they have to bring in more personnel, which would increase the cost of production. For at least these two reasons, evidence shows that the traditional ISD model, if it was ever followed in the past, is losing ground now. In this day and age of rapid change, it simply is impractical. In fact, new research in two fields of neuroscience as well as complexity theory has provided a new perspective on the nature of learning and how learning systems should be designed and implemented. First, let's take the case of current developments in brain research. Researchers such as Scott Kelso, in his book titled Dynamic Patterns, have demonstrated that learning is not static but a dynamic process. In other words, people's perception and processing of objects and events change in time, sometimes very rapidly. Also, Kelso, as well as other researchers such as Esther Thalen and Linda Smith, demonstrated that learning is a self-organized activity, that the important element in learning is the learner. This may sound self-evident and simple. You may be saying to yourself that this fairly complex video conference was not necessary to broadcast such a simple truth to you. However, if you look around you or look back at your own school days, you realize that by and large our educational systems worldwide are teacher-oriented. They are designed by the teachers for the teachers. Very rarely you see systems that are designed from the learner's perspective or by the learners. So what I'm proposing may be self-evident, but this obvious truth is not the base of educational practice today. When we look at learning as a process of self-organization, we realize that learning is driven by tasks which the learner needs to perform at a given point in time. Developmental psychologists like Jean Piaget have long maintained that children learn by exploring their environment, formulating simple if-then hypotheses, test their hypothesis by moving or exploring objects, refining their hypothesis, testing them, and so on. They learn by defining a task for themselves and finding the best way to perform that task. In an organizational context, tasks may be defined by the managers or by the employee, but the fact remains that just like in childhood, the basic nature of learning is task-driven and ultimately centered around and within the learner. In other words, learning is self-organized. Another aspect of this self-organization is motivation. Antonio Damasio, in his recent book entitled Descartes' Error, Emotion, Reason, and the Human Brain, demonstrated that certain aspects of the process of emotion and feelings are indispensable for rationality. The new evidence that emotion and reason are intertwined provides a new perspective on the self-organization of learning. Emotions are highly personal matters. Each individual not only is different in his emotional profile, but as we have first-hand experience, emotions are very dynamic, meaning that they change over relatively short periods of time. In his book titled Emotional Intelligence, published last year, Daniel Goleman said that old concept of IQ, or intelligence quotient, revolved around a narrow band of linguistic and math skills, and that doing well on IQ tests was most directly a predictor of success in the classroom or as a professor, but less and less so as life's path diverged from academe. Goleman further listed 5 personal skills which would help us to perform better. These were knowing one's emotions, managing emotions, motivating oneself, recognizing emotions in others, and handling relationships. These highly personal skills directly relate to one's ability to handle emotions as major factors in task performance. Learning is situated in the context of the organization. If you consider the fact that most jobs in today's quality circles and team-oriented management systems require handling relationships, it stands to reason to conclude that managing one's emotional response to situations is of extreme importance and relevance to success. Again, the point here is that self-organization is a primary factor in learning, and in turn it is a primary factor in performing within an organizational context. Now that we have established that learning is a self-organized process, it must be said that it is not without structure. In fact, among other things, the social nature and technology of the workplace structure our learning. If you remember, in our last program, I presented this diagram of transactional distance to demonstrate that dialogue or learner control and structure or instructor control have a dynamic relationship. This diagram, as I mentioned before, was tested in a study that my colleague Rick Scherer and I conducted 2 years ago. In a data-driven empirical study, we tentatively established this dynamic relationship between structure and dialogue. Over time, self-organized activities of learner and the structure provided by the instructor determines the level of transactional distance and, in turn, the rate of teaching and learning. It is perhaps necessary to remind you that such a scenario has been made possible by information-rich environments such as the World Wide Web. In such an environment, both the learner and the instructor can participate in setting goals, choosing content, managing the process of teaching and learning, and even evaluation and certification. Requirements for formal needs assessment as a prerequisite to the process of instructional design, development, and presentation disappear. In this dynamic scenario, the learner and the instructor actively are engaged in real-time needs assessment, design, development, and evaluation. Each side actively participates in the process. In fact, in this scenario, one is reminded of Alvin Toffler's concept of the prosumer, where it is difficult to distinguish between the consumer and producer. It is difficult in our case to distinguish the learner from teacher, as they both have a role in each other's jobs. This scenario, however, holds true as long as learning and teaching would be limited to available information, the mass of knowledge available on the web, in the libraries, and other repositories. Learning is an act of construction in the information-rich society. As you may very well can imagine, many of today's tasks do not have predetermined job aids, checklists, flowcharts, and the like. Increasingly, workers are asked to solve problems. In today's information-driven workplace, increasingly you are paid to solve problems. Problem solving, by definition, requires conceptualizing novel solutions, solutions that may not be found in neatly designed and developed web pages or in manuals and technical books. To a large degree, learning in the contemporary high-technology, information-rich business and industry depends upon constructing new solutions based on the available information. However, as your customers' needs change, you need to respond to such changes as expeditiously as possible. Very often, problem solving involves the participation of many players and stakeholders. Video conferencing capabilities become handy for such constructivist learning working sessions. It is becoming relatively easy for industries, businesses, and government organizations to hold ad hoc conferences using personal desktop conferencing systems or group video conferencing systems. These live, on-demand conferences create the social structure for learning and working, which the Russian psychologist Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. In short, the zone of proximal development brings the whole organization into the process of learning. Learning becomes a process of socialization and a matter of organizational development. More recently, Peter Senge, in his book, The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of Learning Organizations, described the dynamics of learning organization from a system dynamic perspective. This is the same perspective which Rick Scherer and I chose to analyze the dynamics of learning at an instructional level, and Scott Kelso chose to analyze the dynamics of the brain function at a micro level. The process of learning in an organization is an individual as well as a group process at the same time. This dynamic model suggests that people in organizations and organizations as a whole have the potential to go beyond learning as problem solving and become inquiring systems. Systems that are engaged in generating new knowledge. Learning as inquiring is a logical extension of learning as problem solving. Generation of new knowledge traditionally has been within the purview of few academicians in research universities. University faculty in departments dedicated to inquiry were perhaps the only professionals who had the opportunity to explore uncharted territories and discover new knowledge, as the rest of the society was involved in the ordinary and mundane tasks of production and distribution of goods and services. We began this program by quoting Alvin Toffler's assertion that humanity faces a quantum leap forward. It faces the deepest social upheaval and creative restructuring of all time. As we are getting close to the end of this segment, let's go back to this statement and re-examine it in light of what we have discussed so far. New knowledge is the currency of the information society. In the coming decades, if Toffler is correct, we all will be faced with having to pass through uncharted territories. Gone will be the days of certainty in decision-making and selecting the best route based on the experience of those who have traveled those routes before you. If you have not noticed it yet, you will soon realize that no matter at which organizational level or division or team you function, what you have to do in order to perform your tasks and reach your objectives will look less and less familiar to you and more strange and novel. Uncertainty will be the rule and not the exception. If complex, creative human organizations follow the same rules as the rest of the universe, including complex systems such as your brain and my brain, they always will be operating at a level close to the certainty of a steady state, but never achieving complete equilibrium for a long period of time. The hallmark of a learning organ such as the brain is that it always stays at the brink of equilibrium. If it achieves a steady state, it will lose its creative power, if not its entire functionality. Creative, forward-looking organizations also need to operate at a level just below achieving stability. In systems theory, total equilibrium and death are synonymous. Life, creativity, and movement, on the other hand, is associated with lack of equilibrium and uncertainty. The news, however, is not as bleak as this. You have help in exploring uncharted territories with relative immunity before you step into such territories. So far, we have used computers in organizations by and large to reduce the drudgery of work. One of the very first uses of computers for office workers were spreadsheets and databases for accounting purposes, and word processing for ordinary correspondence or desktop publishing. Since then, we have used the computer for a variety of other reasons, ranging from creating nice graphics to producing interactive multimedia and even teaching and learning at a distance. I think it is safe to say that perhaps with the exception of a few organizations such as universities and research and development divisions of giant multinational corporations, the computer has been used primarily as a tool for reducing ordinary repetitive work instead of as an extension of the brain to think with. As we are entering a new era in human history, we have new tools to make the road smoother. New software and more powerful hardware systems will allow us to work more creatively, anticipate our need for new information, and help us simulate uncertain situations before committing personnel and other resources to such situations. For example, software programs generally known as intelligent agents will constantly scan the vast resources of the global internet and bring to your attention information you may need for decision-making, problem-solving, research, and development. Furthermore, expert systems will learn standard ways and means of performance from you, but will increase in sophistication to a point that they can assess future pitfalls and provide you with at least a warning, if not with new solutions. Similar software will assist frontline workers as well as managers and strategic decision makers to assess current and future dynamic trends and disseminate their findings throughout the organization. In the past few minutes, we have discussed the emerging information technologies, how these technologies are changing the nature of work, and how they have integrated learning, if not new knowledge generation, as an integral part of what is generally known as work. I have suggested that in the organization of today and for the foreseeable future, working, learning, and new knowledge generation will increasingly blend together and become indistinguishable. Furthermore, I described how new technologies such as fax on demand, the World Wide Web, video conferencing, computer simulators, expert systems, and intelligent agents will assist us to cope with the challenges that a complex global economy will present to us, especially as we interact more and more with our colleagues across borders and across oceans. Equipped with the tools and concepts described in this program, you will be able to cope with the challenges presented to you by the new economy of our global village.
Thank you, Dr. Saba. Let us begin the second question and answer session. Our first question is a fax that we've received from Brazil, General Motors of Brazil. And the question is, the new technologies speed up our work rhythm and a person's anxiety. This generates a loss in quality of life. Is this true? Dr. Saba.
It can be true, but not necessarily. What we all need to learn is not to work harder, but work smarter. And that's easier said than done, because I'm also learning that myself. But we just have to learn that. We just have to learn to think more and do less.
Yeah. The next question, we have a phone call from Mexico, Comisión Federal de Electricidad, Auditoria Atoyac. Your question, please.
Gracias.
In the organization of the present and the future, with this new paradigm of information according to the third wave, this will impact the future, the society of the future. What will this be? How will this affect the humanity as far as quality of life, work, timetables, schedules, etc.?
The same theme.
Yes. It's interesting that our audience are thinking about the quality of life issues.
Yes.
Well, I guess I have some similar response to this one, to the last question, and that is that we just have to be more conscious about our quality of life, and we have to assess these technologies and their impact on our environment, not necessarily the biological or ecological environment, but also the organizational environment. There are no easy answers to any of these questions, because these questions ought to be answered within the context of your organization, of your work situation.
And that's a question, I think, that is not theoretical for you or I. All of us are coping with the pace of life, the quality of life. Absolutely.
That's right.
We have a question now through the wonders of modern technology, all the way from Tijuana, our neighbor next door, the Instituto Politécnico Nacional, CITEDI, in Tijuana. Your question, please.
Sí, muy buenos días.
Buenos días.
Sí, la pregunta es la siguiente.
The question is the following. The use of technology impacts on the size of the organization. In other words, that it can function with less personnel. And so what we want is precisely to conserve personnel, to keep it up, to avoid layoff. What do you think we should do with the current personnel in order not to lay it off and to retrain them?
Dr. Saba?
Well, I think the answer was embedded in your question. Retraining is the best solution, or one of the very best solutions, so that the retrained personnel can be helpful in creating more services and more products. They would be able to increase the productivity of your organization.
Absolutely. It's a challenge. We have a question now all the way from Spain, from Barcelona. Your question, please.
Buenos días, América.
Good morning, America.
Habla Luis Luengo, y me gustaría
I
dar
am,
un saludo en primer lugar.
first I would like to convey our greetings to the University of Panama, particularly that has made this possible together with ITC of San Diego. What is the role that the training should take place in the change processes, and how can we apply these formative and training processes?
The training question.
Well, training is the heart of the matter, and everyone needs to learn how to become more knowledgeable about the technologies, about the culture, and about the environment in which he is working. It is no longer a separate process. It is now part and parcel of management, production, sales, marketing. All of these processes now include training. So that's how you should look at it. You should look at training as an integral part of your organization.
And an important part of learning the new technologies that we have to adapt people to